Miss Marple and the Murder at Foxglove Farm, narrated by Edward from Warm Pages. Welcome, dear listeners. I'm so glad you're here with us tonight for another cosy mystery from the world of Miss Marple. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Share it in the comments. I always enjoy reading each one, and if these gentle mysteries bring you comfort, don't forget to like and subscribe. We have a new story waiting for you every single day. Now, make yourself cozy, and let's begin. Chapter 1. Early Bell. The mist hung low over the chalk downs that April morning, wrapping Foxglove Farm in a gossamer shroud that muffled even the lowing of the cattle in the near pasture. Ben Harcourt pulled his cap down against the dampness as he made his way across the yard, his shepherd's crook tapping against the cobblestones with a rhythm as familiar as his own heartbeat. 23 years he had tended sheep on these rolling hills, and he knew every hollow and rise as well as he knew the lines on his weathered hands. The dinner bell's sudden clanging shattered the morning quiet like a stone through glass. Ben stopped dead in his tracks, his head jerking up toward the iron bell that hung beneath the kitchen eaves. 6 o'clock in the morning, and someone was ringing the dinner bell with urgent, irregular strokes that spoke of panic rather than purpose. "What the devil?" Ben muttered, quickening his pace toward the farmhouse. The bell continued its frantic summons, the sound bouncing off the barn walls and echoing across the misty fields. It was all wrong. The dinner bell was rung at noon and 6 in the evening, never at dawn, and certainly never with such desperate urgency. As he rounded the corner of the main barn, Ben could see that the bell rope hung slack now, swaying slightly in the still air. The clanging had stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving an ominous silence in its wake. The shepherd felt a cold prickle of unease between his shoulder blades as he approached the cluster of farm buildings. Foxglove Farm had been in the Grant family for 3 generations, a prosperous dairy operation that sprawled across 200 acres of some of the finest grazing land in the county. Oliver Grant ran it with the same methodical precision his father had employed, rising before dawn to check on his prize Guernseys, and retiring only when the last of the evening chores was complete. It was not like Oliver to be about so early with the dinner bell, and it was certainly not like him to ring it in such a manner. Ben's unease deepened as he noticed that the cowshed door stood wide open. Unusual for this time of morning when the cattle were still out in the far pasture. He could hear no sound of movement from within, none of the gentle lowing or shifting that typically accompanied the morning milking preparations. "Mr. Grant?" Ben called out as he approached the calf shed, his voice seeming thin and insubstantial in the muffled air. "Mr. Grant, are you about?" No answer came from the dim interior of the shed. Ben hesitated for a moment at the threshold, then stepped inside, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the gloom. The smell hit him first. The usual odours of hay and animals overlaid with something else, something that made his stomach lurch with instinctive alarm. Oliver Grant lay face down among the straw, his arms flung out at unnatural angles, his usually neat grey hair dishevelled and damp with moisture that was not entirely from the morning mist. His tweed jacket was rumpled, and there was something peculiar about the way he lay, as though he had fallen suddenly and without any attempt to break his fall. "Dear God," Ben whispered, dropping to his knees beside his employer. Even as he reached out to touch the still figure, he knew it was too late. Oliver Grant's skin was already cooling, taking on the waxy pallor that spoke of death, and there was no pulse to be found at his wrist or throat. Ben scrambled to his feet, his mind reeling. He had seen death before. It was part and parcel of farm life, but this was different. This was wrong in ways that went beyond the simple fact of Oliver's passing. The dinner bell, the open shed door, the way the body lay sprawled among the straw, as though Oliver had simply collapsed where he stood. The shepherd backed toward the shed door, his hands shaking as he tried to process what he had discovered. He would need to fetch Dr. Haydock from the village and notify Mrs. Grant and contact the authorities. But first, he needed to think, needed to understand what could have brought Oliver Grant to such an end in his own calf shed, on what should have been an ordinary April morning. It was as Ben stepped back into the grey morning light that he noticed Miss Jane Marple, picking her way carefully across the farmyard, a small wicker basket clutched in her gloved hands. The elderly lady from St. Mary Mead moved with surprising steadiness despite her age, her sharp blue eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her, with the thoroughness of one who had learned never to overlook the significance of small things. "Mr. Harcourt," she called softly, her voice carrying clearly in the still air, "I do hope I'm not calling too early. I've brought some strawberry runners for Mrs. Grant. She mentioned at the parish meeting that she was hoping to expand her kitchen garden." Ben found himself oddly grateful for her presence, though he could not have explained why. There was something reassuring about Miss Marple's calm demeanour, her matter-of-fact approach to whatever situations presented themselves. She had a reputation in the village for being uncommonly observant, though some dismissed her insights as merely the gossipy musings of an elderly spinster. "Miss Marple," Ben began, his voice hoarse with shock, "I am afraid there has been a terrible accident. Mr. Grant, that is to say, I have just found him in the calf shed, and he appears to be dead," Miss Marple finished gently, setting down her basket and moving toward the shed with brisk efficiency. "Yes, I rather suspected as much when I heard the bell ringing in such an extraordinary fashion. Most irregular, you know, for the dinner bell to be sounded at this hour." As she spoke, Miss Marple's keen gaze fixed upon the bell rope that hung near the kitchen door. Even from where they stood, Ben could see that something was not quite right about it. The rope appeared to glisten in the grey morning light, as though it had been coated with some slippery substance. "How very curious," Miss Marple murmured, moving closer to examine the rope without touching it. "The rope appears to be quite slick with something. Bacon grease, I should say, by the look and smell of it. Most peculiar indeed." Ben stared at her, then at the rope, understanding beginning to dawn in his troubled mind. "You mean someone greased the rope deliberate-like?" "It would appear so," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "though I dare say we should not jump to conclusions just yet. There may be a perfectly innocent explanation." But even as she spoke, her expression suggested that she found such an explanation increasingly unlikely. The mist began to lift as the morning progressed, revealing the purple foxgloves that grew in wild profusion along every hedgerow and field boundary. They nodded in the gentle breeze like harbingers of secrets yet to be discovered, their bell-shaped blooms beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Chapter 2. Body in Hay. Dr. Haydock arrived within the quarter hour, his black medical bag clutched firmly in his hand and his usually genial face set in grim lines. The village doctor had attended more deaths than he cared to count in his 30 years of practice. But there was something about this particular summons that had filled him with an inexplicable sense of foreboding during his hurried drive from St. Mary Mead. "Well, Ben," he said briskly, nodding to the shepherd who waited anxiously by the calf-shed door, "what have we here?" Miss Marple had tactfully withdrawn to a respectful distance, though her sharp eyes continued to observe every detail of the proceedings. She stood near the kitchen garden gate, her basket of strawberry runners temporarily forgotten as she watched Dr. Haydock enter the dim interior of the shed. The examination did not take long. Within minutes, Dr. Haydock emerged, his face grave and troubled. He pulled off his spectacles and cleaned them with unusual deliberation, a gesture that Ben had come to recognise as a sign of the doctor's deep concern. "How long has he been dead, Doctor?" Ben asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Not long, Doctor," Haydock replied, settling his spectacles back on his nose. "I should say he died within the last hour, possibly less. The body is still quite warm, you see, and rigor mortis has not yet begun to set in." Miss Marple approached with her characteristic quiet step. "If I may ask, Doctor, what was the cause of death?" Dr. Haydock glanced at her with the respect he had learned to accord the elderly lady's observations. "Most peculiar thing, Miss Marple. The pupils are contracted to mere pinpoints, which suggests digitalis poisoning. Foxglove, you know. Classic symptom, that. I have seen it before in cases where someone has mistaken the plant for something harmless." "Foxglove," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, her gaze travelling to the purple blooms that nodded along the nearby hedgerows. "How very interesting. And yet, Doctor, I noticed that no foxgloves grow within the shed itself." "Precisely what struck me as odd," Dr. Haydock agreed. "If Oliver had accidentally ingested foxglove, one would expect to find evidence of the plant nearby. Leaves, perhaps, or flowers that had been gathered for some purpose. But the shed contains nothing but hay and the usual farm implements." Ben shifted uneasily from foot to foot. "Mr. Grant knew about foxgloves, Doctor. Warned us all about them, he did, when we first came to work here. Said they were deadly poison and not to be touched under any circumstances." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "A knowledgeable farmer would hardly mistake foxglove for something edible. Most curious." The sound of a motorcar engine announced the arrival of Inspector Slack, whose aggressive driving and generally brusque manner had earned him few friends in the surrounding villages. He emerged from his police car with characteristic impatience, his small eyes already scanning the scene with the suspicious thoroughness of one who expected to find evidence of criminal activity in the most innocent circumstances. "Right then," Inspector Slack announced, striding toward the small group gathered near the shed. "What have we got here? Accident, I suppose, or some fool who couldn't tell a mushroom from a toadstool?" Dr. Haydock straightened his shoulders. "I am afraid it is not quite so simple, Inspector. The deceased shows clear signs of digitalis poisoning, but there are no foxgloves within the shed where he was found, nor any evidence that he had been handling the plant recently." Inspector Slack's expression darkened. "Are you suggesting this was deliberate, Doctor?" "I am suggesting nothing at this stage, Doctor," Haydock replied carefully, "merely stating the facts as I have observed them." Inspector Slack grunted and pushed past them into the shed. Miss Marple watched him go with a slight frown, then moved closer to where Oliver Grant's body lay among the scattered straw. Something had caught her attention, a small detail that the others had overlooked in their focus on the more obvious aspects of the scene. Kneeling with some difficulty beside the body, Miss Marple examined Oliver's clothing with the methodical care of one accustomed to noticing small but significant details. His tweed jacket was rumpled and stained with moisture from the shed floor, and his usually neat appearance was dishevelled in a way that suggested he had fallen suddenly and without warning. It was then that Miss Marple noticed the grain. A single kernel of rye clung to the sleeve of Oliver's jacket, its golden surface gleaming dully in the filtered light that entered through the shed's small windows. She glanced around the interior of the building, noting that the feed stored here was entirely appropriate for dairy cattle, hay, silage, and various supplements, but no rye. With a quick glance to ensure that Inspector Slack was occupied elsewhere, Miss Marple carefully detached the grain from the fabric and slipped it into her handbag. It was a small thing, perhaps meaningless, but her long experience had taught her that the most trivial details often proved to be of the greatest significance. "Most interesting," she murmured to herself, rising carefully to her feet. Inspector Slack emerged from the shed, his face flushed with the effort of his examination. "Right then. I am sealing this yard pending further investigation. No one is to touch anything or remove any evidence without my express permission." He began stretching police tape across the shed entrance, his movements sharp and decisive. "Ben Harcourt, I shall need a statement from you about the discovery of the body. Dr. Haydock, I shall require a full report on the cause of death, and I want it on my desk before the end of the day." Miss Marple stepped forward with her usual quiet deference. "Inspector, if I may make a small observation—" "Thank you, Miss Marple," Inspector Slack interrupted curtly, "but I believe I can manage a straightforward case of accidental poisoning without assistance from amateur detectives." Miss Marple inclined her head graciously. "Of course, Inspector. I merely thought you might find it interesting that Mr. Grant appears to have had contact with rye grain, when Foxglove Farm is, as I understand it, purely a dairy operation." Inspector Slack paused in his work with the police tape. "Rye grain? What makes you say that?" "Oh, nothing of great significance, I am sure," Miss Marple replied with apparent innocence. "Merely that one notices these small details, you know. The way a grain might cling to fabric, for instance, when one has been handling such things." Dr. Haydock looked thoughtful. "She's quite right, Inspector. Oliver Grant dealt exclusively in dairy cattle. He grew no grain crops at all, and his cattle feed came from suppliers who specialised in dairy nutrition. Inspector Slack's expression grew even more suspicious. "Are you suggesting that someone else was involved in this business?" "I am suggesting nothing," Miss Marple said gently. "Merely observing that there are certain inconsistencies in the scene that might bear investigation." The sound of footsteps on the cobblestones announced the arrival of Mrs. Grant, Oliver's widow, who had been fetched from the house by one of Inspector Slack's constables. She was a small, neat woman in her 50s, with greying hair and the capable hands of one accustomed to hard work. Her face was pale with shock, but she maintained her composure with the stoic dignity that was characteristic of country people faced with tragedy. "Mrs. Grant," Dr. Haydock said gently, moving to intercept her before she could approach the sealed shed, "I am so very sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Doctor," she replied, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly. "I cannot understand what Oliver was doing in the calf shed at such an early hour. It was not his usual routine." Inspector Slack looked up from his work. "Mrs. Grant, I shall need to ask you some questions about your husband's movements this morning and yesterday evening." "Of course, Inspector," she replied, "though I fear I may not be of much help. Oliver rose early, as was his custom, and I assumed he had gone about his usual morning inspection of the livestock." Miss Marple listened to this exchange with interest, her mind already beginning to piece together the fragments of information she'd gathered. The greased bell rope, the absence of foxgloves within the shed, the mysterious rye grain, each detail seemed insignificant on its own, but together they suggested a picture far more complex than the simple case of accidental poisoning that Inspector Slack seemed determined to pursue. As the morning progressed and the mist finally lifted completely, revealing the full extent of Foxglove Farm's rolling pastures and neat buildings, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that Oliver Grant's death was neither accident nor suicide, but something far more sinister. The question that remained was not whether he had been murdered, but by whom and why, and most importantly how the killer had managed to administer a fatal dose of digitalis in a location where no foxgloves grew. Chapter 3. Foxglove Tea. The kitchen at Foxglove Farm retained the warmth and comfort of generations of family meals, with its great oak table scrubbed white from years of use, and its gleaming copper pots hanging in orderly rows above the ancient aga. Yet this morning, an atmosphere of unnatural tension pervaded the familiar space, made all the more unsettling by the lingering aroma of something herbal and bitter that hung in the air like an unwelcome guest. Mrs. Ivy Monk, the housekeeper, stood at the great stone sink with her back rigidly straight, her capable hands working mechanically at washing the breakfast crockery. She had been with the Grant family for 15 years, arriving as a young widow seeking employment and remaining to become an indispensable part of the household. Her greying hair was pulled back in its customary severe bun, and her black dress bore the crisp white apron that was her professional uniform. Yet there was something in her manner that suggested she was far from her usual composed self. Miss Marple entered the kitchen quietly, having been invited by Mrs. Grant to wait there, while the inspector conducted his preliminary examination of the premises. The elderly lady's sharp eyes immediately took note of the teapot that sat upon the scrubbed wooden table, its brown earthenware surface still emanating a faint warmth that suggested recent use. "Such terrible thing," Mrs. Monk said without turning from her washing, her voice carefully controlled but with an underlying tremor that spoke of genuine distress. "To think that poor Mr. Grant should come to such an end, and in his own farmyard too." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed gently, settling herself into one of the Windsor chairs that surrounded the table. "It must have been a great shock for everyone in the household." Mrs. Monk turned then, her pale blue eyes meeting Miss Marple's with an expression of barely concealed anxiety. "That it was, miss. I cannot understand what took him to the calf shed so early. It was not his usual way at all." Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the teapot, from which emanated that peculiar herbal odour she had noticed upon entering. It was not unpleasant exactly, but neither was it the familiar fragrance of ordinary breakfast tea. There was something medicinal about it, something that stirred an uneasy memory in the back of her well-stocked mind. "I do hope you will forgive my curiosity, Mrs. Monk," Miss Marple said in her most apologetic tone, "but I cannot help noticing that unusual aroma. Have you been brewing herbal tea this morning?" Mrs. Monk's hands stilled on the dishcloth she had been using to dry a plate. "Why, yes, miss. Mr. Grant was particular fond of his chamomile tea in the mornings. Said it settled his stomach better than the ordinary sort." "Chamomile?" Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "How very sensible of him. I'm quite fond of herbal teas myself, though I must confess this particular aroma is not quite what I would associate with chamomile." The housekeeper's face flushed slightly, and she busied herself with hanging the dishcloth on its proper hook. "Well, miss, I expect different preparations might smell differently. I am no expert in such things." Miss Marple rose from her chair with apparent casualness and moved closer to the teapot. The strange, bitter scent was stronger here, and underneath it she detected something else. Something floral and cloying that definitely bore no resemblance to the gentle apple-like fragrance of genuine chamomile. "Mrs. Monk," she said carefully, "might I trouble you to show me the tea strainer? I find myself quite curious about herbal preparations, and I should so like to see what remains of the leaves." The housekeeper's face went pale, and for a moment she seemed unable to speak. Then, with visible reluctance, she moved to the teapot and lifted its lid, revealing the fine mesh strainer that sat within. Miss Marple leaned forward to examine its contents, and what she saw confirmed her growing suspicions. Caught in the mesh were fragments of purple petals, their distinctive bell-like shape still recognisable, despite having been steeped in hot water. They were unmistakably foxglove petals, and quite fresh ones at that. "Dear me," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice betraying none of the alarm she felt. "These do not appear to be chamomile leaves, Mrs. Monk." Before the housekeeper could respond, the kitchen door burst open to admit a young woman, whose tear-stained face and dishevelled appearance spoke eloquently of recent grief. This could only be Rachel Grant, Oliver's daughter, though Miss Marple had not previously made her acquaintance. She was a pretty girl in her mid-20s, with her father's strong jaw and her mother's gentle brown eyes, currently red-rimmed with weeping. "Oh, Mrs. Monk," Rachel cried, rushing to the housekeeper's side, "I cannot bear it. Poor father to die in such a horrible way, and they are saying it was foxglove poisoning, but how can that be possible?" Mrs. Monk's arms went around the distraught girl with genuine maternal warmth. "There now, Miss Rachel, do not distress yourself so. These things happen, tragic as they are." But Rachel pulled away, her face flushed with a mixture of grief and indignation. "You do not understand, Mrs. Monk. They will think—" That is to say, Inspector Slack was asking the most dreadful questions about my herbalism studies. Miss Marple looked up with renewed interest. "You study herbalism, Miss Grant?" Rachel turned to face the elderly lady, wiping her eyes with a sodden handkerchief. "I am sorry. I do not believe we have met. I am Rachel Grant. I was Rachel Grant, I should say. I am married now to Giles Trent, though we continue to live here at the farm." "Miss Jane Marple," came the gentle reply. "I am so very sorry for your loss, my dear." "Thank you," Rachel said, attempting to compose herself. "Yes, I have been studying the medicinal properties of plants for some years now. It began as a hobby, but I had hoped to perhaps make something more of it. Open a small practice, perhaps, helping people with natural remedies." "How very admirable," Miss Marple observed. "And I suppose such studies would necessarily include knowledge of the more dangerous plants as well as the beneficial ones." Rachel's face crumpled again. "That's precisely why Inspector Slack suspects me. Because I know about foxgloves, because I have been working with plant extracts and tinctures. But father would never have taken anything I prepared. He was always warning me to be careful, always making me promise to keep my preparations locked away where no one could accidentally consume them." "What sort of preparations do you make with foxglove?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I have been experimenting with a tincture for treating sheep heartworm," Rachel explained, her voice growing steadier as she focused on the technical aspects of her work. "Digitalis, properly prepared and administered, can be effective for certain cardiac conditions in livestock, but Father knew about it. He even helped me research the proper dosages and safety precautions." Mrs. Monk had grown increasingly agitated during this conversation. "Miss Rachel, perhaps you should not be discussing such things just now. The inspector might misunderstand." But Rachel shook her head firmly. "There is nothing to misunderstand, Mrs. Monk. Father would never have touched my foxglove tincture, not under any circumstances. He knew how dangerous it was, knew that even a small amount could be fatal to humans." Miss Marple studied the young woman's face carefully. There was genuine grief there, certainly, but also a kind of bewildered innocence that suggested she had not yet fully grasped the implications of her father's death. Rachel Grant might be knowledgeable about plant poisons, but she seemed genuinely shocked that anyone would suspect her of using that knowledge for murderous purposes. "Miss Grant," Miss Marple said carefully, "where do you keep your foxglove preparations?" "In the old dairy, in a locked cabinet," Rachel replied promptly. "Father insisted on it, said we could not be too careful with such dangerous substances about the farm." "And the key?" Rachel's hand moved instinctively to the small chain that hung about her neck, from which dangled a tiny brass key. "I always keep it with me. Father's orders, you understand." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her gaze returning to the teapot with its incriminating contents. Someone had clearly used foxglove to poison Oliver Grant, but the evidence suggested it had been administered in the form of tea, rather than as a carefully measured tincture. This implied either a desperate improvisation or a deliberate attempt to cast suspicion upon Rachel and her herbalism studies. The sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor announced Inspector Slack's approach, and Miss Marple quickly resumed her seat at the table. She had learned much in the past few minutes, but she sensed that the most important revelations were yet to come. The mystery of Oliver Grant's death was proving to be far more complex than a simple case of mistaken identity or accidental poisoning, and she suspected that before it was resolved, more than one person's carefully constructed facade would crumble like the foxglove petals in Mrs. Monk's treacherous teapot. Chapter 4. 2 Ledgers. The study at Foxglove Farm bore the distinctive stamp of a practical man who had little patience for ornament but great respect for order. Oliver Grant's desk stood in the centre of the room, its mahogany surface scarred by years of use, but meticulously organised, with each paper in its proper place, and every pen returned to its designated holder. The walls were lined with agricultural journals dating back decades, their spines faded, but their contents still consulted regularly by a man who believed that successful farming required constant study and adaptation. Inspector Slack had commandeered this sanctuary for his investigation, spreading his official papers across the desk with little regard for the careful organisation that had been its hallmark. He moved through Oliver Grant's private effects with the methodical thoroughness of a man accustomed to finding secrets in the most innocent-appearing documents, his small eyes sharp with suspicion as he examined each ledger and correspondence. It was behind a stack of veterinary reports that Inspector Slack made his most significant discovery of the morning. His fingers, probing the narrow space between the desk drawer and its frame, encountered something unexpected. A slim volume bound in the same dark leather as the farm's official account books, but hidden with a care that immediately aroused his professional interest. "Well, well," he muttered, working the concealed ledger free from its hiding place. "What have we here, then?" The hidden account book fell open in his hands, revealing columns of figures written in Oliver Grant's familiar precise handwriting. But these numbers told a very different story from the prosperous picture painted by the official farm records that lay openly upon the desk. Where the visible ledgers showed steady profits from dairy sales and modest but consistent growth in the farm's assets, this secret book revealed a pattern of increasingly desperate financial speculation. Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose as he traced the entries with his finger. Wheat futures, purchased in quantities that represented substantial portions of the farm's capital. Initial small gains that had apparently encouraged larger investments, followed by a devastating series of losses that had begun 6 months earlier and continued right up to the previous week. The final entries showed margins called in, brokers demanding payment, and a debt that would have crippled the farm's operations if it had become known. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made Inspector Slack look up from his examination of the damning figures. Giles Trent appeared in the doorway, his face drawn with the strain of the morning's events. Rachel's husband was a tall, lean man in his early 30s, with the weathered complexion of one who spent his days outdoors, but the soft hands of one whose work was more supervisory than manual. "Inspector," Giles said, his voice carefully controlled, "I understand you wish to speak with me about Oliver's affairs." Inspector Slack studied the younger man with the calculating gaze of a predator who had suddenly spotted promising prey. "Indeed I do, Mr. Trent. Please take a seat. I have just been examining your father-in-law's financial records, and I find them most illuminating." Giles settled himself into the leather chair opposite the desk, his movements betraying a tension that he was clearly struggling to conceal. "I am not certain I understand what you mean, Inspector." "Don't you?" Inspector Slack leaned back in his chair, the hidden ledger prominent on the desk before him. "These figures suggest that Oliver Grant was heavily involved in commodity speculation, particularly in wheat futures, substantial losses, mounting debts, margins being called in. Were you aware of any of this, Mr. Trent?" The colour drained from Giles's face, leaving him pale and visibly shaken. For a long moment he said nothing, his eyes fixed upon the ledger as though it were a venomous snake that might strike at any moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I had hoped it would not come to light," he admitted. "Oliver swore me to secrecy, said it would destroy Rachel if she knew how badly things had gone wrong." Inspector Slack leaned forward with predatory interest. "So you did know about the speculation?" "More than that," Giles said miserably. "It was my fault, Inspector. I was the one who convinced Oliver to try his hand at commodity trading. I had done well with a small investment the previous year, made enough profit to buy Rachel a proper engagement ring, and I thought, foolishly I now realise, that Oliver might benefit from the same sort of opportunities." "You advised him to speculate with the farm's money?" Giles nodded, his face a picture of guilt and remorse. "At first, it went well. Oliver was cautious, conservative in his investments, and we made steady if modest gains. But then wheat prices began to fluctuate wildly, and what had seemed like certain profits turned into devastating losses almost overnight." Inspector Slack consulted the hidden ledger again, his finger tracing the damning progression of figures. "According to these records, the farm is essentially bankrupt. The losses exceed the value of the livestock and equipment combined." "Oliver was confident he could recover," Giles said desperately. "He had a plan to sell the back pasture to raise capital for one final investment that he was certain would restore everything. He said the land was not particularly productive anyway, and that the sale would give us enough money to clear the debts and start fresh. And if this final speculation had failed as well?" Giles's shoulders sagged under the weight of his guilt. "Then we would have lost everything. The farm, the house, Rachel's inheritance, all of it would have been gone." Inspector Slack closed the ledger with a decisive snap. "That provides a very strong motive for murder, Mr. Trent. A man faced with financial ruin, responsible for leading his father-in-law into disastrous speculation, might well decide that Oliver Grant's death was preferable to public exposure and disgrace." "No!" Giles half rose from his chair, his face flushed with indignation. "You cannot seriously suggest that I would murder Oliver. He was like a father to me, treated me as the son he never had. I would have done anything to help him recover from those losses, including administering a fatal dose of foxglove extract." "I know nothing about plants or poisons," Giles protested. "Rachel is the one with knowledge of such things, not me. And besides, Oliver's death does nothing to solve the financial problems. If anything, it makes them worse, because now there is no possibility of recovering the losses through future investments." Inspector Slack made a note in his official pad. "Nevertheless, Mr. Trent, I shall need you to provide me with a detailed account of your whereabouts last evening and early this morning. and I shall want the names and addresses of the brokers who are pressing for payment of these margin calls." As Giles provided the requested information, his voice heavy with defeat, Inspector Slack found himself increasingly convinced that he had identified his primary suspect. The younger man had motive, opportunity, and access to the household where the crime had taken place. The fact that he lacked knowledge of plant poisons was unfortunate, but not necessarily decisive. Anyone could have learned about Foxglove from a book, or consulted with someone more knowledgeable about such matters. Yet even as Inspector Slack built his case against Giles Trent, a small, nagging doubt remained at the back of his mind. The crime seemed almost too obvious, too convenient in its revelation of motive and opportunity. In his experience, murderers who are clever enough to use exotic plant poisons were usually clever enough to avoid leaving such clear evidence of their reasons for committing the crime. But then again, Inspector Slack reflected, desperation often made people careless, and a man facing financial ruin might well act impulsively rather than with careful premeditation. The wheat futures losses provided a compelling motive, and the hidden ledger was evidence that could not be explained away by accident or coincidence. The case against Giles Trent was circumstantial but strong, and Inspector Slack was confident that further investigation would reveal the additional evidence needed to secure a conviction. All that remained was to determine exactly how the foxglove poison had been administered, and by what means Giles had gained the knowledge necessary to prepare such a lethal dose. Chapter 5 Missing Spur. The stables at Foxglove Farm occupied a long, low building of honey-coloured stone that had sheltered working horses for more than a century. Though mechanisation had reduced the need for heavy draught animals, Oliver Grant had maintained a pair of sturdy cobs for checking the more remote corners of his property, and their stalls still bore witness to the meticulous care that characterised every aspect of his farming operations. Miss Marple found herself drawn to the stables that afternoon, ostensibly to admire the horses, but in reality, pursuing the quiet investigation that she had learned could often reveal more than the most thorough official inquiry. The building was redolent with the familiar scents of hay and leather, but there was something else in the atmosphere, a sense of recent disturbance that her experienced eye quickly detected. The tack room adjoined the main stable area, its walls lined with carefully maintained bridles, saddles, and the various implements necessary for the proper management of working horses. Each item hung in its designated place on wooden pegs that had been polished smooth by generations of use, and the leather gleamed with a deep lustre that came only from regular applications of saddle soap and careful attention. It was Derek Cole who first brought the missing spur to Miss Marple's attention, though not by design. The cowman had been mucking out the stalls when she arrived, his movements economical and practised despite the obvious strain of the morning's tragic events. He was a man of perhaps 40 years, with the stooped shoulders and weathered hands of one who had spent his life in physical labour, and his usual taciturn manner seemed even more pronounced than usual. "Terrible business, this," Derek muttered as he worked, more to himself than to his unexpected visitor. Poor Mr. Grant to come to such an end. Miss Marple murmured appropriate sympathy, while allowing her gaze to wander over the orderly arrangement of the tack room. It was then that she noticed the peculiarity. A single brass spur hanging alone on what was clearly meant to be a pair of hooks, its mate conspicuously absent. "I do hope you will forgive my curiosity," Miss Marple said gently, "but I could not help noticing that one of the spurs appears to be missing. How very odd." Derek's hand stilled on his pitchfork, and he turned to look where she indicated. His face darkened with what appeared to be a mixture of embarrassment and apprehension. "Aye. Well," he said reluctantly, "that would be on account of the argument I had with Mr. Grant last evening. Not proud of it, I am not, but there it is." Miss Marple settled herself on a convenient hay bale, her manner encouraging confidences. "An argument, Mr. Cole?" Derek resumed his work with unnecessary vigour, as though the physical activity might somehow diminish the weight of his obvious guilt. "Mr. Grant accused me of using the spurs too harshly on Dobbin when I took him out to check the far pasture yesterday afternoon. said I was cruel to the animal and that he would not tolerate such treatment on his property. And was his accusation justified? Derek's face flushed a dull red. The horse was being stubborn, miss. Wanted to turn for home instead of going where I needed him to go. A sharp reminder with the spurs seemed called for, but Mr. Grant saw it differently. What exactly did he say to you? Said if he ever caught me spurring the horses in such a fashion again, he would dismiss me on the spot, Derek replied bitterly. 15 years I have worked for this family, miss, and never had a harsh word from him before. But yesterday he was like a man possessed, shouting at me in front of the other hands, making me look a proper fool. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. And the missing spur? Mr. Grant took it from me then and there, Derek admitted. Said I would not have use for spurs if I could not employ them with proper consideration for the animals. Humiliating it was to be treated like a schoolboy who could not be trusted with his possessions. Most distressing, Miss Marple agreed. And you have no idea what became of the spur after Mr. Grant took it from you? Derek shook his head. Last I saw of it, he was walking toward the house with it in his hand, still muttering about cruelty to animals. I assumed he would keep it in his study until he decided I had learned my lesson. Miss Marple rose from her perch on the hay bale, her mind already working to fit this new piece of information into the puzzle that was slowly taking shape. Mr. Cole, might I ask what you were wearing on your feet yesterday evening? Derek looked down at his sturdy work boots with surprise. These same ones, miss. Only pair I have they are. Miss Marple examined the boots with apparent casualness, noting that they were indeed heavily stained with the rich, dark mud that characterized the lower lying areas of the farm. The soles bore deep impressions where the earth had worked its way into every crevice and crack, creating a distinctive pattern that spoke of recent and prolonged contact with wet ground. You've been working in the muddy areas of the farm, I see. Aye, miss. The lower pasture where we keep the young stock has been terrible boggy after all this spring rain. Spent most of yesterday afternoon down there checking on the fencing. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She recalled her brief glimpse of the calf shed floor that morning, noting that it had been covered with the fine, chalky dust that was characteristic of the well-drained areas around the main farm buildings. If Derek's boots bore only the heavy mud of the lower pasture, it seemed unlikely that he'd been in the calf shed recently, at least not while wearing these particular boots. The sound of voices from the yard announced the return of Inspector Slack from his examination of the farmhouse, and Miss Marple made her way back toward the main buildings with her mind full of new questions. The missing spur represented another piece of the puzzle, but like so many of the clues she had encountered, it seemed to raise more questions than it answered. If Oliver Grant had taken the spur from Derek Cole as punishment for harsh treatment of the horses, what had become of it afterward? And why had she noticed, during her brief glimpse of the body that morning, what appeared to be a single brass spur lying in the straw beside Oliver Grant's still form? The implications were disturbing. If the spur had been found beside the body, it suggested that Oliver Grant's death might not have been the simple case of foxglove poisoning that Dr. Haydock had initially diagnosed. The presence of the spur near the body, combined with Derek Cole's muddy boots and his obvious resentment over the previous evening's humiliation, painted a picture that was both compelling and deeply troubling. Yet Miss Marple's long experience had taught her to be wary of conclusions that seemed too obvious, too convenient in their apparent resolution of complex mysteries. Derek Cole might have had motive and opportunity, but the evidence of his muddy boots suggested that he had not been in the calf shed recently, at least not while wearing his only pair of work boots. The truth, she suspected, would prove to be far more complex and disturbing than Inspector Slack's methodical but unimaginative investigation was likely to reveal. Chapter 6, Midnight Drill. The night air hung heavy with the promise of rain as Miss Marple made her way carefully across the darkened farmyard, a small torch casting a narrow beam of light across the uneven cobblestones. She'd convinced Sergeant Lake to accompany her on this nocturnal vigil, though the young policeman had required considerable persuasion before agreeing to what he clearly considered an elderly lady's fanciful notion. "I still do not understand why we are lurking about in the dark, Miss Marple," Sergeant Lake whispered, as they positioned themselves behind a convenient hayrick that afforded a clear view of the machinery barn. Inspector Slack has already identified his prime suspects, and I am certain he will have this matter resolved within the day. Miss Marple adjusted her position slightly, ensuring that she had an unobstructed view of the barn entrance while remaining concealed from casual observation. I have learned, Sergeant, that the hours of darkness often reveal truths that daylight conceals. People behave quite differently when they believe themselves unobserved. The machinery barn loomed before them in the darkness, a substantial stone building that housed the farm's collection of modern equipment. During daylight hours it buzzed with activity as the various implements were maintained and prepared for their seasonal duties, but now it stood silent and seemingly deserted, its windows dark rectangles against the pale stone walls. For the first hour nothing disturbed the quiet of the night save the distant lowing of cattle and the rustle of small creatures moving through the hedgerows. Sergeant Lake shifted restlessly beside her, clearly regretting his decision to humour what he undoubtedly considered the whims of an overly imaginative old woman. It was just as the church clock in St Mary Mead was striking midnight that their vigil was rewarded. A figure emerged from the shadows near the farmhouse, moving with the careful stealth of someone who wished to avoid detection. In the dim starlight, Miss Marple could make out the tall, lean form of Giles Trent, his movements betraying a tension that was evident even at a distance. "Well, I never," Sergeant Lake breathed, his scepticism evaporating as he witnessed this unexpected development. Giles approached the machinery barn with obvious familiarity, producing a key from his pocket and unlocking the heavy wooden door with practised ease. Light spilled briefly into the yard as he disappeared inside, then was quickly extinguished, suggesting that he had closed the door behind him. Within moments, a second figure appeared, this one smaller, and moving with the quick, nervous steps of someone operating under considerable stress. Miss Marple recognised Mrs. Monk, even before the housekeeper's face was briefly illuminated by the pale moonlight that filtered through the broken clouds. "Mrs. Monk," Miss Marple murmured to herself. "How very interesting." The housekeeper disappeared into the barn, and for several minutes all was quiet. Then a new sound began to emanate from within the building, a mechanical whirring that Miss Marple recognised as the sound of an electric drill being operated with considerable urgency. "What on earth are they doing in there?" Sergeant Lake whispered. Before Miss Marple could respond, voices began to carry across the still night air. Though the words were indistinct, the tone was clearly argumentative, with Giles's deeper voice providing a counterpoint to Mrs. Monk's higher, more agitated tones. The drilling stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of metal clanging against stone. More voices, increasingly urgent, and then the barn door opened again, spilling light into the yard as both figures emerged carrying what appeared to be several large milk churns. "Seed money," Giles's voice carried clearly across the yard, though his tone suggested desperation rather than satisfaction. "It has to be enough to cover the margin calls, Ivy, or we are all ruined." Mrs. Monk's reply was lost in the night breeze, but her posture suggested profound agitation as she helped Giles load the churns onto a small farm cart. Sergeant Lake was already reaching for his whistle when Miss Marple's restraining hand fell upon his arm. "Not yet, Sergeant. Let us see what else they reveal." As they watched, Giles produced what appeared to be a piece of paper from his pocket and held it over a small brazier that Mrs. Monk had produced from somewhere within the barn. The paper caught fire instantly, burning with the bright, acrid flame of something soaked in accelerant. "That is evidence being destroyed," Sergeant Lake protested in an urgent whisper. "Indeed it is," Miss Marple agreed, "but we must determine what kind of evidence and why they feel compelled to destroy it at this particular moment." The burning paper was dropped into the brazier, where it continued to smoulder with an oily smoke that suggested it had been treated with something more combustible than mere ink. Even from their concealed position, Miss Marple could detect the distinctive smell of farm diesel, a detail that she filed away for future consideration. Giles and Mrs. Monk worked quickly to extinguish the brazier and conceal any evidence of their nocturnal activities. The milk churns were wheeled away into the darkness, presumably towards some predetermined hiding place, while the housekeeper carefully swept the area around the barn entrance. "They are certainly thorough," Miss Marple observed quietly. "Should we not arrest them now?" Sergeant Lake asked. "They have clearly been engaged in some sort of criminal activity." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "I think not, Sergeant. What we have witnessed tonight is certainly suspicious, but it may not be directly connected to Oliver Grant's murder. Better to let them believe their activities have gone unnoticed while we investigate further." As if summoned by her words, the barn door opened one final time and Giles emerged alone, carrying what appeared to be a burnt scrap of paper. He examined it carefully in the moonlight, his face a mask of anxiety, before crumpling it and thrusting it into his pocket. "There," Miss Marple whispered with satisfaction. "Now we have seen something that may indeed prove relevant to our investigation." Sergeant Lake moved to intercept Giles as he made his way back toward the farmhouse, his official authority finally overcoming his deference to Miss Marple's unconventional methods. "Mr. Trent," he called softly but with unmistakable authority, "I think you had better explain what you and Mrs. Monk have been doing in that barn." Giles froze like a rabbit caught in the beam of a poacher's lamp, his face draining of colour as he realised that his midnight activities had been observed. For a moment it seemed as though he might attempt to flee, but the futility of such an action in his own farmyard was evidently clear to him. "Sergeant Lake," he said with an attempt at casual greeting that fooled no one, "I did not realise you were conducting a night patrol." "The burnt paper in your pocket, Mr. Trent," Sergeant Lake said firmly. "I should like to examine it, if you please." With obvious reluctance, Giles produced the crumpled fragment, his hands shaking as he handed it over. Even in the dim light, Miss Marple could see that it bore the distinctive markings of an official document, though the flames had obscured most of the text. "A Wheat Futures margin call," Giles admitted miserably, "dated this morning, several hours after Oliver's death. Ivy was helping me dispose of evidence that might be misinterpreted." Miss Marple studied the young man's face carefully, noting the genuine anguish that seemed to underlie his obvious guilt. Whatever Giles Trent and Mrs. Monk had been doing in the machinery barn, she was increasingly convinced that it was connected to financial desperation rather than murder, though the distinction might prove to be more subtle than Inspector Slack was likely to appreciate. Chapter 7. Burnt Receipt. The morning following their midnight vigil found Miss Marple seated at the kitchen table in her cottage, the charred fragments of the burnt receipt spread before her like pieces of a particularly challenging jigsaw puzzle. She had persuaded Sergeant Lake to allow her to examine the evidence before it was officially processed, arguing with characteristic gentle persistence that her experience with such domestic mysteries might prove invaluable. The fragments were pitifully small, their edges blackened and brittle from the flames that had been intended to destroy all evidence of their existence. Yet Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most significant clues were often those that someone had taken the greatest pains to conceal, and she approached the task of reconstruction with the methodical patience that had served her so well in previous investigations. Using a magnifying glass borrowed from her nephew Raymond and a pair of tweezers more commonly employed for removing splinters, Miss Marple began the delicate work of arranging the pieces according to their probable original positions. The paper had been of good quality, the sort used for official correspondence, and despite the damage inflicted by fire, portions of the text remained legible. "Most instructive," she murmured to herself as the document began to take shape under her careful ministrations. The letterhead, though partially obscured, was clearly that of Hartwell and Associates, a London firm specialising in commodity futures trading. The date was unmistakable despite the charring. It had been issued that very morning, several hours after Oliver Grant's body had been discovered in the calf shed. This timing immediately struck Miss Marple as significant, for it suggested that someone had been conducting business in Giles Trent's name even as the investigation into the murder was beginning. More intriguing still were the charred edges of the document, which bore a distinctive oily residue that Miss Marple recognised from her observation of the previous night's activities. The paper had clearly been soaked in farm diesel before being set alight, an unusual accelerant that suggested careful premeditation rather than hasty improvisation. "Not hearth soot," Miss Marple observed aloud, comparing the residue to samples from her own fireplace. "Definitely diesel fuel, and applied quite deliberately." The implications of this discovery were troubling. If the receipt had been doctored with diesel fuel and burned hours after Oliver Grant's death, it suggested that someone was attempting to create false evidence that would incriminate Giles Trent in activities that had occurred after the murder. But who would have had access to such documents? And why would they go to such elaborate lengths to frame a man who already appeared guilty of financial impropriety? Miss Marple set down her magnifying glass and considered the various suspects who had emerged during the investigation. Giles himself seemed the most obvious candidate, given his admission of guilt regarding the wheat futures speculation and his obvious desperation to conceal the extent of his losses. Yet his genuine distress during the previous night's confrontation with Sergeant Lake suggested a man overwhelmed by circumstances rather than one orchestrating an elaborate deception. Mrs. Monk represented a more intriguing possibility. The housekeeper had clearly been complicit in the midnight destruction of evidence, but her motives remained unclear. She had served the Grant family faithfully for 15 years, yet her nervous behaviour since the discovery of the body suggested that she harboured secrets that went beyond mere loyalty to her employers. The sound of footsteps on the garden path interrupted Miss Marple's reflections, and she quickly gathered the fragments of the receipt into a manila envelope before answering the knock at her door. Inspector Slack stood on her doorstep, his face bearing its customary expression of barely controlled impatience. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "I understand that Sergeant Lake allowed you to examine evidence from last night's arrest. I must insist that all such materials be turned over to the proper authorities immediately." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple replied with her usual gracious compliance. "I was merely attempting to assist in whatever small way I could. Please, do come in, and I shall give you my findings." Inspector Slack followed her into the sitting room, his suspicious gaze taking in the orderly arrangement of her investigative materials. "And what exactly have you discovered, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple handed him the envelope containing the receipt fragments, along with a neatly written summary of her observations. "The timing is most significant, Inspector. This margin call was issued several hours after Mr. Grant's death, yet someone took considerable pains to destroy it using farm diesel as an accelerant." Inspector Slack examined the fragments with grudging interest. "You are suggesting that this was planted evidence?" "I am suggesting that the circumstances surrounding its destruction are highly irregular," Miss Marple replied diplomatically. "The use of diesel fuel, in particular, suggests someone with intimate knowledge of farm operations, yet also someone with access to official financial documents." "Giles Trent fits that description perfectly," Inspector Slack observed. "He had both the farming knowledge and the financial connections necessary to obtain such documents." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed he does, Inspector. Yet one must ask why he would go to such elaborate lengths to create evidence against himself, particularly when his guilt in the matter of the wheat futures speculation was already evident from the hidden ledger." Inspector Slack frowned, clearly reluctant to abandon his theory despite the logic of Miss Marple's observation. Perhaps he was attempting to confuse the timeline, to suggest that his financial difficulties began after the murder rather than before. "A possibility," Miss Marple agreed, "though one might equally argue that someone else was attempting to strengthen the case against Mr. Trent by providing additional evidence of his desperate circumstances." The inspector's expression grew increasingly sceptical. "And who, pray tell, would have both the motive and the means to engage in such an elaborate deception?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "That, Inspector, is precisely what we must determine, though I suspect that when we do, we shall find that the truth is considerably more complex than it initially appeared." As Inspector Slack departed with the evidence, Miss Marple returned to her kitchen and the careful work of piecing together the fragments of information she had gathered. The burnt receipt was clearly significant. but its true meaning would only become apparent when viewed in conjunction with all the other clues that had emerged during the investigation. She thought of the greased bell rope, the mysterious rye grain, the foxglove petals in the teapot, and the missing spur that Derek Cole claimed had been confiscated by Oliver Grant. Each piece of evidence pointed in a different direction, yet Miss Marple was increasingly convinced that they all formed part of a single, carefully orchestrated plan. A plan that had required intimate knowledge of the farm's operations, access to its buildings, and a thorough understanding of the relationships between its various inhabitants. The question that remained was not who had killed Oliver Grant, but rather who among the suspects possessed both the means and the motive to execute such an elaborate scheme, while simultaneously attempting to deflect suspicion onto others. Chapter 8. Wrong Boot Prints. The overnight rain had transformed the barnyard clay into a treacherous surface that recorded every footstep with the fidelity of wet concrete, creating a natural archive of all who had passed that way in the hours since the storm had ceased. Miss Marple picked her way carefully across the hardened mud, her keen eyes taking note of the various impressions that marked the well-travelled paths between the farm buildings. It had been 3 days since Oliver Grant's death, and Inspector Slack's investigation had settled into a pattern of methodical but increasingly frustrated inquiry. The inspector remained convinced that Giles Trent was his man, yet the accumulating evidence seemed to raise as many questions as it answered, creating a puzzle that defied his preference for straightforward solutions. Miss Marple had requested permission to examine the calf shed once more, ostensibly to satisfy her curiosity about some minor detail that continued to trouble her. Inspector Slack had grudgingly agreed, though he made it clear that he considered such activities a waste of valuable time that could be better spent building the case against the obvious suspect. The interior of the calf shed had been thoroughly processed by the official investigation, its surfaces dusted for fingerprints, and its contents catalogued with bureaucratic precision. Yet Miss Marple had learned that the most significant clues were often those that escaped the notice of minds trained to look for the dramatic rather than the subtle. The floor of the shed told its own story in the language of footprints preserved in the fine chalk dust that covered the worn stone flags. Miss Marple crouched with some difficulty beside the spot where Oliver Grant's body had been found, her magnifying glass trained on the impressions that surrounded the area like a constellation of evidence. Most of the prints were large and masculine, bearing the distinctive pattern of heavy work boots worn by men accustomed to outdoor labour. These were easily identifiable as belonging to Ben Harcourt, Doctor, Haydock, and Inspector Slack himself, all of whom had legitimate reasons for entering the shed on the morning of the discovery. But there were other prints as well, smaller and more delicate, with the narrower heel and pointed toe characteristic of a woman's boot. These impressions were particularly clear in the undisturbed dust near the back wall of the shed, where they formed a curious pattern that suggested someone had stood there for some time, perhaps observing or waiting. "Size 4, Miss Marple murmured to herself, measuring the length of the clearest impression against her own gloved hand, "and worn by someone of slight build, judging by the depth of the impression in the dust." The size immediately suggested Mrs. Monk, whose small stature and quick, nervous movements had been evident from their first meeting in the farmhouse kitchen. But Miss Marple's long experience had taught her to be cautious about drawing conclusions based on superficial evidence, and she determined to verify her suspicions through more careful observation. Her opportunity came later that afternoon, when she encountered the housekeeper in the village shop purchasing supplies for the Grant household. Mrs. Monk's manner was, if anything, even more nervous than before, and she started visibly when Miss Marple approached her with a friendly greeting. "Such a trying time for everyone at the farm," Miss Marple observed sympathetically. "I do hope you're managing to cope with all the additional pressures." "Well enough, miss," Mrs. Monk replied, though her voice lacked its usual steady confidence. "Though it is hard to know what the future holds, with all this terrible business." Miss Marple allowed her gaze to drop naturally to the housekeeper's feet, where she observed a pair of sensible black leather boots, that showed the kind of careful maintenance one would expect from someone of Mrs. Monk's methodical nature. The boots were indeed size 4, as Miss Marple had estimated, and they bore the distinctive wear pattern of someone who spent long hours on her feet. But it was the heel wear that particularly caught Miss Marple's attention. Mrs. Monk's right boot showed the characteristic inward scuffing of someone who walked with a slight limp or favoured that foot in some way, creating an asymmetrical pattern that would be as distinctive as a signature to anyone trained to observe such details. "I do hope you have not injured your foot, Mrs. Monk," Miss Marple said with apparent concern. "I could not help noticing that you seem to favour your right side slightly when you walk." Mrs. Monk's face flushed, and she shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. "An old injury, miss. Nothing to concern yourself about." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically and took her leave, but her mind was already working to process this new information. If Mrs. Monk's right boot consistently scuffed inward due to her walking pattern, then the prints in the calf sheed should show the same distinctive wear pattern. Yet her memory of those impressions suggested something quite different, a wear pattern that scuffed outward rather than in, as though made by someone wearing boots that did not properly fit. That evening, Miss Marple paid a discreet visit to the farm's laundry room, where the household spare clothing was kept in neat, organised rows. Her search was brief but productive, revealing a second pair of black boots tucked away on a high shelf, clearly belonging to Mrs. Monk but showing no signs of recent wear. These spare boots were identical in size and style to the ones the housekeeper habitually wore, but their soles told a different story. The wear pattern was minimal and symmetrical, without the distinctive inward scuffing that characterised Mrs. Monk's regular footwear. More significantly, when Miss Marple examined them closely with her magnifying glass, she found traces of the fine chalk dust that was characteristic of the calf shed floor. "Most illuminating," she murmured, carefully replacing the boots in their original position. The implications were clear and deeply disturbing. Someone had deliberately worn Mrs. Monk's spare boots to create false evidence in the calf shed, knowing that the small size and feminine style would immediately point suspicion toward the housekeeper. But the deception had been flawed, for the perpetrator had failed to account for the distinctive wear pattern that would have characterised genuine prints made by Mrs. Monk herself. This suggested a level of premeditation and cunning that went far beyond the simple poisoning that Dr. Haydock had initially diagnosed. Someone had planned Oliver Grant's murder with meticulous care, anticipating the investigation that would follow and taking steps to ensure that suspicion would fall on others rather than the true killer. But who among the residents of Foxglove Farm possessed both the intimate knowledge necessary to execute such a deception and the cold calculation required to implicate an innocent woman in murder? Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that the answer lay not in the obvious motives of financial desperation or personal grievance, but in something far more complex and dangerous, a web of relationships and secrets that had been years in the making. As she made her way home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple found herself thinking of the various clues that had accumulated during the investigation. Each piece of the evidence seemed designed to point suspicion in a different direction, creating a maze of false leads and red herrings that would have confused a less experienced investigator. But Miss Marple had learned to look beyond the obvious, to seek the pattern that connected seemingly unrelated details into a coherent whole. Chapter 9. Hidden Draft. The grain sack stood in the corner of the feed store like a monument to the interconnected nature of farming communities, its coarse burlap surface bearing the faded stamp of Meadowbrook Farm, the neighbouring arable operation that supplied various feeds to Foxglove's purely dairy enterprise. Miss Marple had been drawn to examine it by the memory of that single rye grain she had discovered on Oliver Grant's sleeve, a detail that continued to puzzle her despite the accumulation of more dramatic evidence. It had taken considerable persuasion to convince Inspector Slack to allow her access to the feed store, and even then he had insisted that Sergeant Lake accompany her to ensure that no evidence was disturbed. The young policeman stood patiently by the door while Miss Marple conducted her methodical examination of the sack's contents, her experienced fingers sifting through the golden grains with the care of an archaeologist uncovering ancient treasures. "I still do not understand what you hope to find, Miss Marple," Sergeant Lake observed. "The cause of death has been established, and we have identified several suspects with clear motives. Surely the investigation should focus on more substantial evidence than a single grain of rye?" Miss Marple looked up from her examination with a gentle smile. "I have found, Sergeant, that the most insignificant details often prove to be the most illuminating. This particular grain tells us that Mr. Grant had recent contact with rye, yet Foxglove Farm grows no grain crops whatsoever." "Perhaps he visited the neighbouring farm," Sergeant Lake suggested. "Farmers often consult with one another about various matters." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed, "though I understand from Mrs. Grant that her husband rarely left the farm during the busy spring season, preferring to focus his attention on his own operations." As she spoke, Miss Marple's fingers encountered something unusual among the grains, a folded paper that had been carefully concealed within the sack's contents. She withdrew it with delicate precision, her heart quickening as she recognised the official appearance of the document. The paper was a legal draft, written in the formal language of property law, but bearing no signature or official seal. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the typed text with growing interest. It was a tenancy transfer agreement, meticulously prepared to convey ownership of Foxglove Farm's back pasture, some 40 acres of decent grazing land, to one Benjamin Harcourt, shepherd, in consideration of faithful service and at the nominal rent of 1 shilling per annum. "Most extraordinary," Miss Marple murmured, passing the document to Sergeant Lake for his examination. The sergeant's eyebrows rose as he read the terms of the proposed agreement. This would represent a considerable gift to Ben Harcourt. 40 acres of good land, even at the edge of the property, must be worth several £1,000s. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "and the timing is most interesting. The draft is dated just 1 week ago, suggesting that Mr. Grant was contemplating this generous gesture in the final days of his life. They found Ben Harcourt in the shepherd's cottage that adjoined the main farmyard, a modest stone building that had housed generations of men who had tended sheep on these rolling downs. The shepherd was seated at his kitchen table, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug of tea, his face bearing the stunned expression of a man still struggling to comprehend the morning's tragic events. "Mr. Harcourt," Sergeant Lake began formally, "we have discovered a document that requires your explanation." Ben looked up with tired eyes as the sergeant placed the tenancy draft on the scarred wooden table before him. The shepherd's face went pale as he recognised the document, and his hands began to tremble slightly as he reached for his tea. "Where did you find this?" he asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "Hidden in a sack of rye grain," Miss Marple replied gently. "Grain that came from the neighbouring farm, if I am not mistaken." Ben's shoulders sagged with the weight of confession. "Aye, it came from Meadowbrook. I collect feed for the farm sometimes, when Mr. Grant is too busy with other matters." "And the document?" Sergeant Lake pressed. Ben was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the damning paper before him. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with guilt and shame. "Mr. Grant promised me that land," he admitted. "Said if I could prove that young Giles was stealing from the farm, skimming money from the milk sales or some such, then he would see me right with a bit of land of my own." Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. "And what did you discover about Mr. Trent's activities?" "The wheat futures business," Ben replied miserably. "I knew something was amiss when I saw Giles meeting with strange men in motor cars, talking in whispers and looking nervous-like, so I started watching, following him when he thought no one was about." "And you reported these observations to Mr. Grant?" Ben nodded. "Last week it was. I told him about the secret meetings, about the papers I saw Giles burning behind the machinery barn, about the way he would disappear for hours at a time with no explanation for where he had been." Sergeant Lake made careful notes as Ben continued his confession. "Mr. Grant was furious when he learned the truth. Said Giles had been gambling with the farm's money, making risky investments that could ruin them all. He promised me that draft would be signed and made official as soon as he dealt with the matter." "But then Mr. Grant died," Miss Marple observed quietly. "Aye," Ben said, his voice thick with emotion. "And now there will be no land for me, no reward for my loyalty, just questions and suspicions and the knowledge that I'd betrayed a man who trusted me." Miss Marple studied the shepherd's face carefully, noting the genuine anguish that marked his features. "Mr. Harcourt, you mentioned following Mr. Trent and observing his activities. Did you perhaps visit the calf shed on the morning Mr. Grant died?" Ben's face flushed a deep red, and he could not meet her eyes. "I went there early, before dawn it was, hoping to catch Mr. Grant before the day's work began, to ask him about the land deed and when it might be made official. And what did you find?" Mr. Grant was already there, lying in the straw like he had just fallen down. I thought at first he might have had a seizure or some such, so I tried to rouse him, to move him away from the calves that were milling about. Sergeant Lake looked up sharply from his notes. "You moved the body?" Ben nodded miserably. "I pulled him clear of the animals, tried to find a pulse or some sign of life, but it was too late. He was already gone. That is when I panicked and ran, thinking that if I were found there, people would assume the worst." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Sergeant Lake. This explained the rye grain on Oliver Grant's clothing. It had come from Ben's pockets during his frantic attempt to revive his employer. "Mr. Harcourt," she said gently, "I must ask you directly, did you kill Oliver Grant?" "No," Ben cried, his voice breaking with emotion. "I may have been foolish, may have been greedy for that bit of land, but I never harmed Mr. Grant. He was a good master, fair and decent, and I would never have raised a hand against him." Miss Marple believed him, recognizing the genuine grief that underlied his confession. Ben Harcourt was guilty of concealment and perhaps of avarice, but she was increasingly convinced that he was not guilty of murder. Chapter 10. Truth Harvested. The dawn light filtered through the kitchen windows of Foxglove Farm as Miss Marple sat at the great oak table, her hands folded quietly before her, while Inspector Slack paced the flagstone floor with barely contained impatience. The entire household had been assembled for what she termed a reconstruction of events, though the inspector's sceptical expression suggested he viewed the exercise as an unnecessary theatrical performance. Mrs. Grant sat pale and composed in her customary chair, while Rachel clung to Giles's hand with the desperate grip of someone still trying to comprehend how her world had been shattered. Ben Harcourt stood awkwardly near the door, his cap twisted between his weathered fingers, while Derek Cole shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, clearly wishing himself anywhere but in this room of accusation and suspicion. Mrs. Monk moved about the kitchen with mechanical efficiency, preparing tea with hands that trembled only slightly, her face a mask of professional composure that did not quite conceal the anxiety lurking beneath. She had been the most reluctant to participate in Miss Marple's proposed reconstruction, but Inspector Slack's authority had prevailed over her protests. "Now then," Miss Marple began in her gentle voice, "I believe we have all been looking at this tragic affair from the wrong perspective. We have been so focused on the obvious motives, financial desperation, family disputes, professional grievances, that we have overlooked the one person who had both the means and the opportunity to orchestrate such an elaborate deception." Inspector Slack stopped his pacing. "Get on with it, Miss Marple. Who do you accuse?" Miss Marple's gaze settled on Mrs. Monk, who had gone very still beside the stove. "I am afraid, Inspector, that the person responsible for Oliver Grant's death is someone who knew this household so intimately that she could manipulate every detail to cast suspicion elsewhere. Someone who had access to all areas of the farm, who understood the relationships between family members, and who possessed the knowledge necessary to use both poison and misdirection with deadly effect." Mrs. Monk's teacup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the flagstones with a sound like a gunshot in the sudden silence. "Mrs. Ivy Monk," Miss Marple continued quietly, "you killed Oliver Grant, and you very nearly succeeded in ensuring that others would pay for your crime." "That is preposterous," Mrs. Monk said, but her voice lacked conviction. Why would I harm Mr. Grant? He has been nothing but kind to me these 15 years. Miss Marple rose from her chair with deliberate care. Because you feared he would cancel Ben Harcourt's land promise when the Wheat Future's losses became known. You and Ben are secretly engaged, are you not? The land represented your future security, your chance to leave service and become a farmer's wife with property of your own. The housekeeper's face crumpled, but she made no denial. You knew about the foxglove tincture Rachel prepared for the sheep, Miss Marple continued. You had access to her locked cabinet. Housekeepers always have duplicate keys. But Digitalis alone acts slowly, and you could not risk Oliver surviving long enough to discover Ben's betrayal regarding Giles's activities. So you struck him with the brass spur Derek had carelessly lost, a tiny puncture that would be overlooked in the confusion of apparent poisoning. Mrs. Monk sank into a chair, her face ashen. You cannot prove any of this. I think I can, Miss Marple replied gently. You laced Oliver's morning chamomile with foxglove extract, but when he began to weaken, you struck him with the spur to ensure a quick death. Then you staged the bell alarm using bacon grease on the rope to avoid leaving fingerprints, a clever touch that would suggest someone else had rung for help. She moved to the kitchen window, gazing out at the farmyard where the tragedy had unfolded. You wore your unused Sunday boots to plant false evidence later, knowing that their different wear pattern would be overlooked in the initial investigation. You swapped teapots to incriminate Rachel, the innocent chamomile pot for the one containing foxglove residue, and you burned that Futures receipt hours after Oliver's death, soaking it in diesel to frame Giles for ongoing financial crimes. Inspector Slack was scribbling furiously in his notebook. But what about Ben Harcourt's involvement? Ben arrived early to plead for his land deed, Miss Marple explained. He found the body and in his panic dragged it clear of the calves. The rye grain from his pockets transferred to Oliver's clothing during this well-meaning but misguided attempt at assistance. Then he fled, too frightened to report what he had discovered. Mrs. Monk's composure finally shattered completely. It was not supposed to happen like this, she whispered. Oliver was going to ruin everything. When he learned about the wheat losses, he would have blamed Ben for bringing him the information, would have cancelled the land promise out of spite. So you decided to ensure he could not, Miss Marple said with infinite sadness. The land was our only chance, Mrs. Monk continued, tears streaming down her face. Ben and I have been walking out in secret for 2 years, planning to marry when he had something to offer besides a shepherd's wages. 40 acres would have made us independent, given us a proper start in life. Ben stepped forward, his face stricken with horror. Ivy! What have you done? I never wanted this. Never asked for anyone to be hurt on my account. Mrs. Monk looked at him with desperate love. I did it for us, Ben, for our future together. Oliver would never have understood. He lived his whole life with security, never knowing what it meant to scrape and save and still have nothing to show for it. Inspector Slack moved to place her under arrest, but Mrs. Monk held up a trembling hand. There is no need for restraints, Inspector. I will come quietly. I know when I am fairly caught. As she was led away, Mrs. Monk turned back once to look at the kitchen that had been her domain for 15 years. I am sorry, she said to Mrs. Grant. You were always kind to me, and I repaid that kindness with betrayal. I hope someday you can forgive me. The farmhouse felt empty after the police departed, leaving the family to grapple with the revelation that their trusted housekeeper had been a murderer. Rachel wept quietly against her husband's shoulder, while Mrs. Grant sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the woman she'd known with the calculating killer Miss Marple had exposed. "How did you know?" Giles asked eventually. "What gave her away?" Miss Marple adjusted her gloves with characteristic precision. "Many small things, my dear. The greased bell rope suggested someone familiar with household tasks. The swapped teapots required intimate knowledge of the kitchen routine. The timing of the burnt receipt was too convenient, too obviously designed to implicate you. But it was the boot prints that confirmed my suspicions. Only someone with access to Mrs. Monk's spare footwear could have created such misleading evidence." She rose to take her leave, pausing at the kitchen door to deliver her final observation. I am afraid Mrs. Monk forgot the most important rule of successful deception. Never underestimate the power of love to drive people to desperate acts. Her love for Ben Harcourt was genuine, but it blinded her to the consequences of her actions. As Miss Marple walked back towards St. Mary Mead, she reflected sadly on the waste of it all. Oliver Grant's death, Mrs. Monk's imprisonment, Ben Harcourt's disgrace, Giles Trent's financial ruin, all the result of one woman's desperate gamble for security and happiness. Behind her, the purple foxgloves nodded in the morning breeze, beautiful and deadly as ever, their bell-shaped blooms an eternal reminder that the most innocent appearances often conceal the darkest secrets.